So my concept today is a sleepy one. Certainly, it does not seem a very promising concept for facing this world's critical challenges, as our invitation invites us to do. Still, I would like to try to unfold something here, a kind of inquiry, or perhaps rather a reverie, leading from a word as it has been operating in my current work to a tentative meditation on being in the world, perhaps even in this world. Part one is called metabolic reading. Recently, I have been rereading certain well-known texts within my field with an eye to elements within them connected to earth and matter that seem to have been lying there dormant, curiously unnoticed, as if waiting to be reawakened. The metaphor became, before I had the time to think through it, a method, a call to retrace and re-enliven the roots by which our texts connect to earthly history. The procedure is an exorbitant one because it involves probing far beyond what is present and active in the text, bringing back into view entire buried worlds that exceed what the text can reasonably contain. I have found this type of inquiry to be vertiginous, for there is no end to the work that it involves, and also moving, because it has increasingly appeared that something else is speaking to us through our literature. But it has also seemed risky, broody, end-of-worldy, I meant to change that word, eschatological, for it can leave the text discreetly overwhelmed and undone, as if not quite adding up, like something that has been opened up and into which one cannot fit everything back again. It is almost as if entrusting parts of itself to a kind of strategic dormancy were indeed what allowed a text to hold together as a contained, reasonable, functioning unit in the first place, Thangam. Indeed, reminding us of ourselves, the parts of ourselves we consign perhaps to a form of dormancy in order simply to go on. To give you an example, of the kind of work I'm talking about, in a much-studied novel titled Les Choses, or Things, by French writer Georges Perec, published in 1965, after many chapters that near hysterically enumerate the shiny consumer commodities and agricultural bounty of 1960s France, there is a section situated in the comparatively desolate Tunisia, described as arid, sterile desert. I had occasion to read this book many times over the years, along with criticism on it that invariably read this section psychologically, allegorically, philosophically, and even politically. Tunisia symbolized the void at the heart of, or the dystopian limits of, the protagonist's consumer delirium, because it was part desert, because it stood outside the circuits of Western consumer society, because it was alien and opaque to their manufactured desires, because they could not read its ciphered signs, or because it was a primarily agricultural society situated in a pre-capitalist temporality. So these are the kinds of readings that have been done over the decades. And I'm not actually going to read these quotes, but this is where, but there are two things here I will be mentioning. But then more recently, my own thoughts more and more intensely preoccupied with the crises of our times and the suspicion that all modern fiction is telling us something about how we got here, I started to interrogate tiny details which revealed another picture. In fact, a passing reference to phosphates, so in that first paragraph, and I won't be spending a lot of time on this novel, so don't worry if you're not able to read the quotes closely. So in fact, a passing reference to phosphates was not just another reality effect intended to fill or to label the landscape, but the novel's way of registering an entire colonial infrastructure built around the intensive extraction of Tunisian phosphate at this time, and its transport to and export from the port of Sfax, which is where these protagonists are staying. Phosphate, as we know, is a chemical fertilizer critical to industrial-scale agricultural production. Starting in the 19th century, as the soils of Europe became depleted through overexploitation, it had become a veritable obsession. Maintaining soil fertility in Europe and America, write historians Christophe Bonneuil and Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, indeed depended first on guano, then on phosphates. The seeming desolation and aridity of Tunisia tellingly described as mineral in the novel. So this is the second paragraph where mineral can very easily be read as a kind of metaphorical or abstract kind of description of the landscape. So this seeming desolation and aridity described as mineral, in fact, described the predicament of a place turned into a literal open mineral mine, involving an underpaid and overworked workforce, unscrupulous lobbying and preferential treaties, ensuring that the earnings went to French and European companies, and a leaching of Tunisia's subsistence economies as more and more land, labor, and resources were redirected to mining over agriculture and grazing. By the mid-1920s, writes historian Rebecca Gruskin, parched fields in Tunisia exposed the colonial dispossession and exploitation that enabled fertile fields in Europe, end quote. In other words, Tunisia, far from being located outside commodity capitalism, on the contrary, directly and vitally fueled and undergirded the giddy prosperity of the post-war boom, what's known as the Trente Glorieuses in France. And historians Bonneuil and Fressoz have described a reorganization of world metabolism in these years. This is their language, a period during which there is a doubling of world population, a doubling of world GDP, and the consumption of minerals and mining products for industry jumped more than threefold. It's a period also which, not coincidentally, there is a 20% deterioration in the terms of trade for developing countries that are exporting mining products and renewable raw materials. So they, they write about this period as a period of great acceleration in production and consumption, but also as a period of capture by the Western industrial countries of the ecological surpluses of the Third World. So unequal metabolic flow. The reactivation of dormant elements in Perec's novel, in this case, the word mineral, the passing reference to phosphates, easily lost amongst many other elements, thus lets emerge a whole stratum of historical, material, and phenomenological history, which had for decades escaped notice by readers. But also it makes it possible to see the novel itself as not just a vessel or carrier of deposits of history, but also as itself advancing in its very form a kind of materialist analysis, precisely the registering of what Marxist ecological thinkers such as John Bellamy Foster and others would call unequal metabolic flow. The movement, disproportionate and in one direction, of critical, organic, world-sustaining matter between the colony or post-colony and the colonial metropolis. So beneath the apparent story of the novel Things, about a couple riding the waves of consumer happiness in 1960s France, it appeared that in fact another story was being told about the world, or if I can be permitted to rephrase this, a story is being told just perhaps by the world. So my method became a book project where I've been reading in this way for dormant elements functioning as a strange kind of timestamp. Decoding them allows one to date a text, not in a precise stratigraphic sense, but in the sense that by leading one to consider what was happening at that time in the realm of material ecological processes and substances and flows, these elements also oblige us to relate certain mental or signifying structures back to certain historical states of earthly matter. In other words, they force us to consider how narrative plot or symbolic meaning may be partly a function of repressed matter. So the whole book is not about fertilizers, but there are other repressed matters in this set of readings I'm doing, including wood and bananas. So I have been calling this metabolic reading, mostly because it is the circulation and transformation of bio and geochemical matter that is being traced. But I like in this word that it may also name the metabolics of dormancy and reanimation at play in the method. So for the record and in gratitude, my inspirations have included Bill Brown's notion of literature's material unconscious and Elaine Freedgood's notion of the ideas in things, that is, what material histories may be repressed or compressed within the things of a text. Thinking about how a text may register such phenomena, even beyond any conscious authorial intent, I have found guidance also in the idea articulated by Claude Lévi-Strauss that the mind's architecture is of the world, so that its creations, in fact, reflect a long-hidden reality of the real world. But what of dormancy, this working metaphor, this irresponsible, possibly problematic concept, as yet unprocessed at the heart of my method? How was I to think of it? Dormant is derived directly from the old French dormant, which is also the new French, today's French, present participle of dormir, itself from the Latin dormire, to sleep. It is by transferred, what the OED calls transferred and figurative senses, that sleep came to be ascribed to other realms of being. While these transferred and figurative senses made it into English, in French, the same adjective, dormant, continues to describe today a person asleep as much as it describes a seed or volcano that is dormant. By calling elements within a text dormant, I knew I was activating a metaphorics, not to say a scenography, whose stakes, not to say politics, remained murky. To hear me tell it, something was sleeping till I came along and awakened it with a gentle kiss. This sounded very much like Sleeping Beauty. In French, La Belle au Bois dormant, which would make me the Prince Charmant, the handsome prince. So this is just to say that this seemed possibly problematic, but I needed to think it through. Part two, to sleep, perchance to dream. But no, there is nothing so neat here, nor masterful, nor magical. The hallucination-like stirring that I have been noting, where the earth seems to be rising up in our texts, coming into startling focus, raises a wholly more unsettling question. Had these elements in the text been asleep, or had I? Where was the dormancy to be located? Was it in them, words turned lifeless, opaque, unmeaning, or in me, in us, unseeing, in energy-saving mode, repeating habituated protocols of reading? Or was it somewhere in between, in this relation or non-relation, as the case might be? And quickly here, of course, I'm telling it in somewhat faux dramatic mode, but obviously I don't mean that it is only me who's able to see these things. I mean that we are in a moment where we can see these things. So here, scientific perspectives have been, in fact, oddly illuminating. Dormancy in plants is defined as the state of being not active or growing at the present time, but able to be active later on. This is an important trait for plants that enables them to survive periods that are adverse for growth, like drought, cold, or heat. The development of dormancy during evolution enabled plants to inhabit environments that would be lethal for continuously growing plants without a dormant phase. This plant feature can manifest itself in different organs like seeds, buds, tubers, and bulbs. During the dormant state, metabolic activity is nearly absent and development comes to a standstill. Dormancy is often associated with low moisture levels and protective structures like a seed coat in seeds or protective scales in buds and bulbs. This is from the entry Dormancy in Plants in the Encyclopedia of Life Sciences. So from my understanding, research into plant and seed dormancy is still in its early stages, partly because studying the state in natural conditions poses logistical difficulties. Dormant seeds may be consumed by predators, buried or otherwise lost to view. Conditions in a laboratory may not be able to fully anticipate and model complex and unstable conditions in this world. But also emergence from dormancy may occur after a long enough period that no individual observer may be present to observe and understand it as such. It is known, for example, that some species of zooplankton can hatch from lake sediments after more than 100 years, and that some microorganisms can be recovered from ancient materials that are 100 million years old. So instances of dormancy and emergence from dormancy can be witnessed everywhere around us as an ordinary phenomenon. What we see when we sow a seed, when a house plant refuses to grow to then unaccountably change its mind, or in the transformation of vegetation everywhere around us during a change of season. More incongruously and dismayingly, we see it when unseasonal weather tricks a flowering plant or tree to bud too early. So this is Ada's reflection on things on rhythms being out of sync, and the unmeeting, your beautiful concept. And then there are those more extraordinary remarked upon events, such as when a certain kind of cicada, not seen in 17 years, suddenly reappears in the millions, or the case of that unusually hot summer in Siberia where a 75-year-old bacterial pathogen emerged from the thawing permafrost to infect thousands of reindeer. Research today suggests that dormancy is an adaptive trait of life itself, where virtually every living population has the capacity to produce seed banks. And so seed banks is really, before it becomes a term describing artificial dispositif for preserving genetic material, actually means these groups of dormant individuals through which a population sort of ensures its survival or likelihood of survival. So, so these are reserves of dormant individuals which increase the survival chances of a species in the long term. Seed banks are by no means restricted to the world of plants. They are created when individuals transition into a dormant state, a process that has independently evolved numerous times throughout Earth's history and is even considered in some origins of life models. In today's inventory of biodiversity, dormancy is integrated into diverse modes of survival and reproduction across domains of life. For example, dormancy is achieved via latency in viruses, sporulation by bacteria and fungi, cyst formation among protists, estivation by amphibians, dower stages by worms, cryptobiosis in rotifers, diapause by insects, torpor in birds, quiescence in fish, delayed blastocyst formation among marsupials, and hibernation in mammals. The principles of dormancy and seed banks have even been extended to stem cell dynamics, tumor persistence, wound healing, immune functioning, and neural activity of brains. Despite their prevalence across seemingly disparate systems and scales, seed banks are governed by a shared set of dormancy-related attributes and processes that allow individuals to disperse in time. As an example of convergent evolution, seed banking represents a common solution to some of the major challenges faced by nearly all forms of life. Across disparate realms of life, then, dormancy appears as a form of extreme plasticity, developed to enable a species to survive periods when living conditions are suboptimal. In most cases, this is a function of excess heat or cold, moisture or drought, or lack of nutrients. But in others, it may be a fine-tuned capacity to sense the presence of hostile entities. Thus, I learn that, I quote, some aquatic species fall into dormancy when they detect the chemical cues that are released by predators in their environment. In other cases, the presence chemically detected of another may in fact wake a species from dormancy, such as in the tick example discussed by Ada. The Jakob von Uexküll description of how the tick stirs into action when it smells the butyric acid emanating from a passing mammal, and this has been taken up again by Heidegger, Deleuze, Merleau-Ponty, etc. Dormancy points fascinatingly to an intelligence located not in an individual consciousness, nor even in a single gene, but in a relation of envelopedness in and responsiveness to an environment at a given time. And the commitment to dormancy, as it is called in the scientific literature, is not always a direct response by an organism to conditions deemed adverse. In many plants and insects, it is determined rather by what biologists and geneticists call the maternal effect or maternal imprinting, which is when the mother, sensing in her environment stresses not conducive to thriving, induces in her offspring or seed the adaptive response of longer or deeper dormancy. What would it mean to make of dormancy an eco-political concept, a kind of noir eco-political concept? In going dormant, an entity registers radically its wariness towards the state of the world at this time. Not to say its disappointment with this world, and here activating the sort of simple etymology of disappointment, depriving itself of its own position within this world. No, I cannot grow and thrive in this world. In the phenomenon of dormancy are metabolized certain essential truths about life in this world that scientific and humanistic thought are in fact converging dramatically today in admitting. One, that a living being is not a sovereign, self-sustaining, separated self, but always in interaction with an environment, this interaction being its life. Two, that to destroy a life-sustaining environment is to destroy that life, genocide. Three, that this world can turn uncaring, uninhabitable, unbearable. Four, that memory and trauma can be and is transmitted across generations. In dormancy, there is something both intensely dystopian, it is the recognition of this world as dystopia, and poignantly utopian, the speculation that one might wake in a better time. Part 3, memory not our own. It seems prudent not to romanticize dormancy, of course. As we know, viruses, bacteria, tumors, cysts seek favorable environments too, no less than olive trees or humans. And they too go dormant when denied these. But also, fundamentally, dormancy, however prevalent, is on the level of the individual an extreme, perilous recourse. In certain microbial populations, I don't know if I have this. Oh. Oh yes, okay, so this is it. In certain microbial populations, just the part in bold, independent of any known cues, dormant individuals randomly wake up and sample their environment. If conditions are bad, then the individual may die or go back to sleep. If conditions are good, then the individual can communicate and coordinate resuscitation with other members of the population. The self-preserving wager of dormancy may always fail. Its logistics, in any case, to my all-too-human brain, seem somewhat nightmarish. And of course, there are science fiction films that play with this kind of scene, the waking up. Still, what remains compelling in dormancy as a mode of disappointment and radical waiting, and I'm remembering Basira's presentation some years ago on waiting in this very conference, what remains compelling about it as a mode of disappointment and waiting is the lag it introduces in phenomenological time, the suspension or the spacing that it affects of one's presence in the world. Différence, dormance. In the possibility of dormancy, however real or virtual, is an insistence on imagining that when one cannot quit a place that has become unkind, one might, as a last resort, be able to quit the time of its unkindness. Indeed, dormancy reframes this unkindness as a time. It can be a message relayed into the future to one's future self or seed. Is the drought over yet? Is there a place yet for us in this world? From this angle, dormancy may describe a begging to defer and to defer within an endlessly positivist, productive, zero-sum world. The seed that will not sprout, heeding long-term memory from its mother, withholds its contribution, introducing an uncanny gray zone into the ledger of what is and what is not. Dormancy may disturb the economy of presence on massive scales. Indeed, in many plant systems, dormant individuals attain densities that exceed the abundance of actively growing individuals by orders of magnitude. Input-intensive agriculture, premised on the heavy systematic industrial use of fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, but also of seeds modified to be drought-resistant and flood-resistant, may be seen in this sense as a wide-scale war against dormancy. That sensitivity by which life records its reluctance to reproduce because it is not a good place or not a good time, or because the environment seems broken, which brings us back to Marx's notion of, the Marxian notion of metabolic rift, when nutrients produced by the soil are not going back into the soil, hence leading to this intense need of the kinds of fertilizers I started out with. And these are also the fertilizers where some of us may be thinking about since the British ship carrying ammonium phosphate sulfate started to sink in the Red Sea. So this kind of intensive use of fertilizers and other sort of agricultural inputs, as they're called, all have to do with this insistence on mass production methods that cannot tolerate the thought of dormancy. And here, the opposite holds equally true, confirming the duplicity we often encounter in descriptions of capitalism or empire. For agrobusiness equally profits from artificially induced dormancy in harvested produce, the most notable examples being flowers and bananas, so that they may arrive fresh at the market after long journeys by ship. So metabolic time in these cases is modified and realigned with the speculative time of capital. The other parenthesis here being that the biopolitical drive to eradicate the unproductive, the ambivalent temporality of dormancy may also be seen in capitalism's war on sleep, as described by Jonathan Crary in 24/7, and anticipated before him perhaps by Jean-Luc Nancy in Fall Asleep, Tombe de Sommeil. But this is not exactly the kind of analogical move I'm interested for reasons I may or may terribly fail to describe below. So yet for me here, as I begin to conclude, I will not try to reclaim dormancy as a form of agency or a stance of critical disappointment of holding this world to higher standards. The dormancy of the microplankton or the seed, if it is a radical ecopolitics, is an ecopolitics where the human vanishes, like man at the end of Foucault's order of things, that disappears in the sand. If there is a dormancy in us, it is not biological or literal, and certainly not available to us as a refuge from hunger or death. Rather, in a wholly other sense, it is a kind of seed bank, memory bank, located nowhere and everywhere, in which human history, as it advances, stores knowledge that awaits later awakening. It is in stories, forms of thinking, claims to thought, to place, unprocessed inheritances, lessons, forgotten powers of speech and action, things learned about the world, known and then forgotten, ways of being surrendered, memories asleep, silences in archives where life used to be, solidarities or struggles that momentarily lost heart and deferred their resumption. Returning to my readings, so within the broad field of sort of literary thought, returning to my readings with these thoughts, I do find, indeed, descriptions of this dormancy everywhere. This is Michel de Certeau in The Practice of Everyday Life. Memory is a sort of anti-museum. It is not localizable. Fragments of it come out in legends. Objects and words also have hollow places in which a past sleeps, as in the everyday acts of walking, eating, going to bed, in which ancient revolutions slumber. A memory is only a Prince Charming who stays just long enough to awaken the sleeping beauties of our wordless stories. Here, there used to be a bakery. That's where old Lady Dupuis used to live. Places are fragmentary and curled up histories, pasts denied legibility by others, accumulated times that can be unfolded, but like stories held in reserve, remaining in an encrypted state. Here is Saidiya Hartman, Venus in 2 Acts. I want to tell a story about 2 girls capable of retrieving what remained dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in my own act of narration. It is a story predicated upon impossibility, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, and refashioning disfigured lives, and intent on achieving an impossible goal, redressing the violence that produced numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse, which is as close as we come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved. And here is Amitav Ghosh in his novel, After the Great Derangement, Gun Island. Some stories, like certain life forms, possess a special streak of vitality that allow them to outlive others of their kind. I'm just skipping to the end because it gets too particular. and that can survive extended periods of dormancy. And the next quote is later in the novel, when the character has visited the shrine that crystallizes a certain story, which itself carries ancestral memory of environmental fragility. It was as if some living thing had entered my body, something ancient that had long lain dormant in the mud. I could only think of it in analogy to germs or viruses or bacteria, yet I knew it was none of those things. It was memory itself, except that it was not my own. It was much older than me, some submerged aspect of time that had been brought suddenly to life. So Amitav Ghosh is here writing of a community's repressed knowledge of rising waters, de certeau of what lively cultures are overlaid by the techno-capitalist logic of the modern city. Saidiya Hartman of the lives of enslaved women violently annihilated in the archive. These are different projects, yet each is defined by the commitment to a memory beyond our own, and each effects a reimagining or a rescaling, not merely well-meaning or consoling, but sober, difficult, and properly political, of defeat as dormancy. That is, considering what was historically defeated not to be extinguished, but dormant. Each attends to buried streams of the human story. Each suggests in its particular way that if we perform the labor of reading and listening with heightened attentiveness and care, we may decrypt or potentialize something by which, in Ghosh's words, inarticulate or silent beings speak to us. And the past, which for all three of these thinkers also carries a secret dormant path to a possibly alternative future, reaches out to us. Each is aware of the delicacy and fraughtness and even the likely failure of the task. Hartman, the most sober of them all, with good reason, writing of, I quote, the arrangements of power that occlude the very object that we desire to rescue, and warning about the lives that she seeks in the archive. Given the condition in which we find them, the only certainty is that we will lose them again, and they will expire or elude our grasp or collapse under the pressure of inquiry. Of all the forms of life, then, we are perhaps not the rare one that simply lacks dormancy, even though this is on some level true, but the one most made of dormancies, which is perhaps simply another word for curled up histories, dare I say concepts, in the sense that to live in this world is to carry with us disappointed but not yet extinct other worlds. And I'd like to end with this quote, which is from de Certeau's writings right after May 68, and it has been translated as the capture of speech, but it's more like the taking of speech or the taking back of speech, and even the awakening of speech. Something happened to us. Something began to stir in us, emerging from who knows where, suddenly filling the streets and the factories, circulating among us, becoming ours, but no longer being the muffled noise of our solitude. Voices that had never been heard began to change us. At least that was what we felt. From this, something unheard of was produced. We began to speak. It seemed as if it were for the first time. From everywhere emerged the treasures, a slumber, in the French endormi, or tacit, of forever unspoken experiences. At the same time that self-assured discourses fell quiet and authorities became silent, frozen existences stirred awake into a prolific morning. Once the metallic carapace of the car was abandoned and the solitary charm of the home TV broken, with traffic stopped, the mass media cut off, consumerism threatened, in a Paris undone and assembled in its streets, wild and stupefied at discovering its face washed clean of its cosmetics, an unknown life surged forth.